Alright, here we go with part 2, Civil War. So 1862, here you have a map of the major battles that happen here. And this is, on the upper left you can see West Virginia becomes its own state in 1863 during the war. But in 1862, most of the battles are being draws or minor victories for the North, and the South is able to hold on to everything that is the South. There is no changing of hands of major parts of land. And again, you can see here the distance between Richmond, the capital there, that's almost in the center of your screen, and Washington, D.C. to the north, about 100 miles. So this is where a lot of the fighting is, and the general of the entire Northern Union is McClellan, Little Mac, and he's unwilling to really do anything to put his men in any real source of danger. Again, it's the idea that, hey, the war doesn't need to be a total war. It can just be like, hey, we'll fight, and then eventually the South's going to give up. And so McClellan had no real motivation to do anything as far as go on the offensive and make the South submit. That just wasn't his style. But he was very popular with his men, so Lincoln couldn't do anything about really getting rid of him until the midterm elections were over. So General Sherman, who's a Union general, this is a quote from him. You don't have to write this down. Whatever nation gets control of the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri rivers will control the continent. And so with what's happening in the Army of the Potomac and with McClellan at a stalemate with the South, mostly fighting against Stonewall Jackson and General Lee of the Confederacy, the war shifts over here towards the Ohio, Mississippi, and Missouri. And General Ulysses S. Grant becomes very important to the Union and the North being able to execute this Anaconda Plan on the western edge of the Confederacy and the Union. So he wins a series of battles from Kentucky to Tennessee to Mississippi all the way down to Louisiana, basically controlling the Mississippi River, now cutting the southern Confederacy off between Texas and Louisiana, and then the other side of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and then you got Arkansas on the other side as well. So controlling those ports and those rivers with what Sherman said would be who would win the war now becomes an advantage of the Union. And this is through 63, 62, and 63 on the western edge. Here's a little bit more about Grant. Grant was he'll replace McClellan and a few other generals that Lincoln picks before him, but he will be willing to put his men in all kinds of danger, and his nickname becomes the Butcher for how many Union soldiers died under his command. But winning was what he was supposed to do, and he did it in whatever way he could find possible, was to be able to win battles, and he did it quite effectively, but many men did die under his command. So here's what we're talking about in a visual. As you can see, from 1862 to 1863, and then eventually 1864 and 1865, the end of the war, as you get these colors going from light to dark pink, that area of the Ohio River down through Kentucky, and then eventually through Tennessee, all the way down to Mississippi. Vicksburg is a key battle that we'll talk about there in a second. On the left side of your screen, I don't have the arrow, there it is, right here, and then we'll talk about Sherman with Atlanta becoming important in 1864. But let's look down here. So never take a victory for granted. Ulysses S. Grant. All right, back to this map here. So as the fighting that's going on here, nothing's really happening. You have 63 um, as a major shift in the war. Early couple years, nothing changed. The South was basically winning because they were defending their territory. And then in 63, there's a couple turning points. One of the major battles that you got to remember is the Battle of Antietam. This is September 17th, 1862, which will lead to, on January 1st, Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. But here, George McClellan and his unwillingness to go on the offensive and attack, he's basically given the plans that the plans are discovered, and he knows where General Lee and the Confederate Army is going to attack at Antietam, and so they meet there, and McClellan has the advantage because he knows Lee's going to attack there, and so let's see here what happens. Well, I got a meme for you. You want me to attack? LOL. So a bunch of people die at Antietam, and there's no real major victory. It's considered a victory for the North, for the Union, but Lee's men retreat, and McClellan refuses to go after them, and this could have been the end of the war. But he decides to just hold his ground and not pursue Lee further past Antietam. So here's what you got to write down about Antietam. It's on the border of Maryland and Virginia. 5,000 plus die, 19,000 wounded. It's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It's considered a Union victory. It could have been complete victory possibility if McClellan would have pursued Lee. Lincoln and McClellan didn't get along very well, but McClellan was so popular that Lincoln could not remove him for fear of losing support for the war. So he stays on until the midterm elections are done, and then he replaces him. But on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the first part of his Emancipation Proclamation, which says any slave in any Confederate states shall be free. This is key. You got to remember this. Write this down. Put a star next to it. Something. But look at it. It says any slave in Confederate states shall be free. So he doesn't have the power necessarily legally to be able to do this, but it also leaves out the border states. So Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, it doesn't free the slaves that are there. Now there are far fewer slaves in those areas, but if he did free the slaves there, then those states might have left the Union and seceded, and that could have caused a whole bunch of other problems. But remember here that the first part of the Emancipation Proclamation only frees those slaves that are in Confederate states. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln wants to emancipate your heart, just like he emancipated the slaves. Abs Lincoln. Alright, so the Emancipation Proclamation in a visual. Those border states are not included in the original Emancipation Proclamation for fear that they might then switch. And so Lincoln does not issue that in those areas. So the effects of emancipation. Blacks seek refuge by fleeing to Union strongholds in the South and to New York and Philadelphia. The key is those that are in the South, as they get word of Lincoln's emancipation and the inability of women, with their men being gone, keeping these slaves from leaving becomes a real problem for the South, and they follow the Union wherever they go. So as the Union has taken over parts along the Mississippi, those become areas in which slaves are now being a part of the Union, and eventually they'll be armed as well and fight. So blacks will join the Union Army, but they're not treated equally. They will enlist when we get to the draft here of 1863. More men will be needed, and so there'll be a force of draft, but these northern blacks will volunteer once this now is a shift. It's no longer necessarily about preserving the Union, but now the focus is freedom and liberty for all people. So there's a good movie, Glory, on how these Union Army men that were black were treated during this time, segregated. They didn't fight alongside of the other whites, but they had white officers. Okay, so then the 13th Amendment is what's passed by Congress and then approved by the states, which becomes a part of the Constitution, which frees slaves constitutionally. This is the key, because legally now the states can do nothing but have to end slavery in their constitutions. But the South has to surrender and then be readmitted to the Union, and their readmission will be contingent upon applying the 13th Amendment or having all of their slavery abolished. All right, so let's talk about the politics of war. In the North, you don't have unification. You have those Northern Democrats, you have the former Whigs, the people that are unwilling to go along with what Lincoln and the Republicans want as far as ending slavery. These people are referred to as copperheads, copperhead snakes, and they become the thorn in the side of the Republican Party and specifically Lincoln. They oppose his issuing of the draft, which we'll talk about in a second, and the use of martial law and the suspension of writ of habeas corpus. So politically, they will oppose Lincoln and the Republicans throughout the war. Okay, so there you go. Northerners not unified in their backing of war efforts. And the centralization of government will happen. We talked about in the last section was all of the things that the taxes, the Homestead Act, all of these different things that were applied by Congress shifts the power away from states and allows the federal government or the centralization of government to happen. Okay, the economics of war. We talked about how the North and the South paid for the war. This is a little bit more detail on that. So the North, which depended on cotton for their textile industries, they'll have to get cotton somewhere else, which will shift the focus of what becomes the textile industries into other types of manufacturing. So inflation will happen as things become scarce. Prices will go up. The replacement of cotton in industry will happen with what is needed for the war in a form of construction, and metals will be the number one thing there. So railroads, building railroads, they'll spend tons of time and hiring people and money on extending the railroads farther west during the war while it's happening, which become great achievements of the North. They'll be able to manufacture the weapons, the cannons, the ammunition, the rifles, the mini balls. The new technology that happens during the Civil War will be a huge advantage for the North. And the Homestead Act that we'll talk about in the next chapter also leads to people moving out west and being able to farm and grow more food to be able to supply the North with, so they wouldn't have a shortage of food. Okay, so you got social tension. The draft causes most of this. You have the ununification of what the war is being fought over, and now the Emancipation Proclamation shifting it towards ending slavery. So you have plenty of riots of those in fear in the North of what the changes might happen afterwards from an entire population of people being freed constitutionally, legally, and what that would do to their jobs and their way of life and all of that kind of stuff. So the draft only makes that worse as these younger, unmarried white men then are forced to fight, and their purpose is to win, to be able to free slaves that are black that then might disrupt their way of life. So it causes all kinds of problems in the North, and specifically in urban cities, Philadelphia, New York, those kinds of areas. So the draft for the North happens in 1863, and there was an out in which you could get a substitute to fight in your place. You could pay $300 and they would find a substitute for you, or you could find somebody as a substitute that would fight in your place. And those became extremely controversial. Um, Even those that were not citizens that pledged their loyalty to the North, they could fight, they could volunteer, or they could be these substitutes, and that they would get their citizenship basically by surviving the war. But then you have this quote here: "Rich man's war, but a poor man's fight," and that becomes something in which is spread and causes more social tension economically between those that have and those that don't have. And why are these younger, poorer people being then forced to fight for some other cause that they didn't really believe in? All right, the South's problems: their men are gone fighting, and so their women are the ones that are in charge of the farms or having to farm themselves if they were yeoman farmers. So being able to do the work of both roles, right? The male's role and the female's role became extremely difficult for the South. You had people dodging the draft. They had their own draft in 1862, and it was very hard for them to be able to get control of those that avoided the draft. Um, Starvation, yeah. The Northern blockade was working, and by 1863 and 1864, it really hit the South and their societies. It became a difficult thing for not only the soldiers to eat, but just the regular people in the South. They couldn't eat their own cotton. They had to be able to get food from somewhere else, and the hope that they had with other countries coming in to help them never materialized. And we'll talk about a battle here in which they tried to be able to get that to happen in a second. Inflation. They print out their own money. Things cost an extreme amount. You couldn't afford it. There wasn't enough of it, and then you didn't have enough money to be able to afford what you could find. And then you have, with those, people that were in need, and so it causes all kinds of riots and theft and real problems for societies in the South. Soldiers began to desert the army and just go back home. They were either tired or they got letters from home saying, hey, things are really bad, you need to come home, and they began to abandon their posts. Sorry, I kind of went fast there. You can get the last one. All right, so the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. Lee decides that they're going to go on the offensive, and they're going to invade the North. This is different. This is not their intent. This isn't what they had envisioned. But the hope is by Lee that they'll be able to get a decisive victory that will bring in support from somewhere else, from Europe. And it will backfire. The Battle of Gettysburg will be a turning point that you got to remember. July 1st through 4th, Lee will lose and have to retreat. And General George Meade will be in charge of the victory here of the Union Army at Battles of Gettysburg. Okay, so remember in 1863, the turning point, there's two. First here is this one at Gettysburg. Lee decides to attack, and the Union victory at Gettysburg becomes a major victory that denies the ability for the South to get any support from any other European country, and also is a decisive victory in which kills lots of the army under General Lee that is there in Virginia. So that one, and then the second one in 1863, in which most describe as a turning point, is Vicksburg, Mississippi, which allows the Mississippi River to be completely controlled by the Union Army. So those two, remember Gettysburg and Vicksburg as turning points for the Civil War, 1863. More memes to come. Here we go. William Sherman's March to the Sea. This is this total war concept in which is adopted by General Ulysses S. Grant. And Sherman is one of these commanders here in the South that will lead to another major victory in Atlanta in '64 that will help Lincoln get reelected. So the policy here is total war. It's scorched earth. He will burn, basically, and destroy everything in his path so that there is no recovery of Southern armies or supplies or anything that would be able to help the South within its future victories. So it completely destroys towns as they go through Georgia all the way up the Atlantic coast up to Virginia. So here's his march to the sea, and then you got to remember this for your quiz. It's the scorchers. So everything in his path is going to be destroyed. This one's funny. I like this one a lot. Okay, so here's his path, and Lincoln would not he probably wouldn't have been elected unless Sherman would have won a key battle here in Atlanta and then used his march to the sea all the way through the Carolinas. And we'll get to that election in just a second, but this is what you got to remember about Sherman's march, taking the South. All right, so the election of 1864. McClellan is the guy that runs against Lincoln. He is a favorite of the Northern Democrats. The men loved McClellan. And so when Lincoln gets rid of McClellan, McClellan becomes his political enemy. And it's probably much closer if that doesn't happen with Sherman in Atlanta as the war shifts. The war became very unpopular in the North, and Lincoln was not well liked after the Emancipation Proclamation kind of split the North as well. So the victory in Atlanta secures that, hey, this needs to continue, and Lincoln's winning this war, and if we want to make sure that happens, then the North should elect Lincoln, and that's what happens here, defeating McClellan. Eventually, you get the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, April 9th, 1865. So Sherman's march to the sea leads towards the cornering of Lee and his men in Virginia. When he surrenders, the war is not officially over. It's also there's another surrender that's signed somewhere else. I can't remember where it's at, but it's not officially over. They have not gotten word of it. There's another surrender, but that's the one you got to remember, is the one at Appomattox Courthouse with Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, then you have Lincoln's assassination, April 14th, 1865. So Lincoln ends up going to a play at the theater, and an actor, John Wilkes Booth, not within the play, but within the kind of scene, the area in which the Maryland, Virginia, he's a famous actor. And so there's an organized plot to kill Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward. And if you're wondering who Johnson is, Andrew Johnson, he's the vice president after Lincoln's second election. And he is a Democrat from the South, from Tennessee. And we'll learn more about him during Reconstruction. And then you have William Seward, who was a political opponent to Lincoln before his original election, but then a cabinet member and an extreme ally to Lincoln during the Civil War. So Wilkes Booth, his goal is here is to basically take out the three most powerful men in the country, and they have tons of meetings here um, at this boarding house, which was owned by Mary Surratt. The man assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson is George Atzerodt, and he fails within that. He gets too afraid and gets drunk and decides not to follow through with the assassination of Andrew Johnson. Lewis Payne and Davy Harold are assigned to kill William Seward, and they're able to stab Seward but not kill him. And there's Seward, Secretary of State William Seward. So he survives the assassination attempt. There's Mary Surratt. She will be in big trouble here as the um, place in which all of these men had designed their assassination plot. Ford's Theater is where Lincoln goes, and is where he is eventually shot. So this is where he's sitting here and overseeing the play that's below him. And since John Wilkes Booth was an actor and had access to these places, he was able to get in the balcony here of the suite that's with all the drapes and stuff. There it is. And he was able to walk in and shoot Lincoln right in the back of the head. Here's what he uses, a little revolver, and he was carrying a knife with him as well. There's the gunfire. Famous painting of what happens here. Then he jumps down from there and runs across the stage and shouts "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always two tyrants," basically claiming that Lincoln was a tyrant. And at the beginning, these people, the accounts say that they thought it was part of the play, like they didn't understand what was going on. And so basically, Wilkes Booth just runs out the side door of the Ford's Theater and escapes, and nobody gets him. This is where Lincoln was taken across the street, and the bed in which he eventually takes his last breaths. Yikes. Too soon? Alright, so then they put this reward out to be able to find John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators towards this assassination. And eventually they find him. Here's his path out of Ford's Theater all the way down. He has help along the way, as these places were all set up in which he could find friendlies to be able to stay with to avoid being captured. Eventually he's cornered in Garrett's farm, and he's killed there April 26, 1865. Others were hanged as they were convicted of being guilty here of this assassination attempt of not only Lincoln but Johnson and Seward as well. So Mary Surratt was one of them there. Then there's eerie similarities between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, who we'll learn about in the second semester here, as president in 1960, but both part of the Tecumseh curse, if you believe in that. Here's some strange coincidences. Lincoln, 1860 election, Kennedy, 1960. Both have 7 letters in their name, both presidents slain on a Friday. Both are slain in the presence of their wives, sitting right next to them. Both directly concerned with civil rights. Both presidents had legality of their elections contested. Kennedy's Secretary Lincoln warned him not to go to Dallas. Lincoln's Secretary Kennedy, yeah, did you catch that? Their names were the opposite. Warned him not to go to the theater. John F. Kennedy's secretary was named, her last name was Lincoln. And Lincoln's secretary's last name was Kennedy. That's pretty crazy. Both of their successors were named Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson was the successor, vice president of John F. Kennedy. Andrew Johnson from Abraham Lincoln. Each of their names have 13 letters in them. Both of them were U.S. senators before they became vice presidents. Both were Southern Democrats. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. Andrew Johnson born in 1808. Both Booth and Oswald, who was the convicted, well, he wasn't convicted, but he was assumed the killer of John F. Kennedy, were both Southerners favoring unpopular ideas. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and hid in a theater. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and hid in a warehouse. Both Booth and Oswald were both murdered before the trial could be arranged. Lincoln and Kennedy were carried to death on the same citation, which is like the horse buggy, like what they carry the casket in. Booth and Oswald were born in 100 years apart. Lee Harvey Oswald, John Wilkes Booth, each name 15 letters. Dun dun dun. All right, now, if you're still with me, I have quiz questions that you could take a look at. Chapter 16 quiz. These could be questions that you would see when you get back. The overall strategic policy of the Union to destroy Confederacy through combination of constant pressure and slowing weighing down the South's ability to wage war was called, yes, B, the Anaconda Plan. Northern advantages in the Civil War included all of the following except, which one do you think it is? A superior navy? No, they had that. Superior military leaders? Yeah, that's what's expected, so B would be your right answer. The Confederate government was able to achieve which of the following goals? Yes, C. Frequent victories over Union armies is correct. 4. When the Civil War started, Abraham Lincoln's primary objective was to A. Preserve the Union. 5. President Lincoln was reluctant to emancipate the slaves in the first year of the Civil War because D. Feared the emancipation would drive the border states out of the Union. Correct. 6. The battle that is considered to be the turning point of the Civil War and the last chance at military victory by the Confederacy is C. Gettysburg. 7. The Mississippi River is controlled by the Union after the fall of B. Vicksburg. 8. Lee surrendered to Grant at A. Appomattox Courthouse. 9. Name one of the border states. There's 4 of them. Delaware. Yes. Maryland. Yes. Kentucky. Yes. Yes, you got the last one. Missouri. Very good. 10. Name the President of the Confederate States of America. His name was Jefferson Davis. Goodbye.